Hello, bio students. So today we're going to continue our ecology unit and we are going to start lesson 5, which is called Exchange of Energy and Nutrients in Ecosystems. So you're going to need your note taker that looks like this. As I go through the note taker, it doesn't necessarily go in order. So pay attention as I am going through the lesson. I'm going to try to point out where you have to write down your notes. But the food pyramid that you see here doesn't exactly look like the food pyramid in the PowerPoint, but you should be able to get the correct answers anyways. And the food web here is a different food web than the one that you will see in the PowerPoint. But you should also be able to write down the correct information as we go through the PowerPoint. Okay, so let's get started. So let's remember that in ecology, everything is connected to everything else. So this is one of the important themes that we've been looking at since the beginning of the unit. So what is energy flow? So we need to know that energy flows in one direction and that energy on Earth comes from the sun. Food chains and food webs show how energy flows in an ecosystem. So for example, here below we see an example of a food chain. And we see that energy is flowing in the direction of the arrow. So for example, the producers or the autotrophs, so producers are also known as autotrophs, we know that they get their energy from the sun, and then that energy is transferred from the producer to the herbivore, and then that energy is transferred to the omnivore or carnivore, and then that energy is transferred to top carnivore. So in other words, the organism that is feeding itself, or the organism that is eating, is the organism that is getting the energy, right? That's why you also need to eat, right, for energy. And once you eat, you have the energy to carry out your day. All right, so let's look a little bit at these food chains and feeding relationships. So we know that all food chains start with energy from the sun up here. And then the sun it provides the energy for these producers or autotrophs to grow. Okay, so who are the autotrophs and the producers? Well, these are organisms that can make their own food, and an example of a producer would be a plant. So we know that these producers are in level 1 of the food chain. Okay, now these producers act as food for level 2 primary consumers, which are known as the herbivores. Now they are known as herbivores because they will only feed on plants. Okay. Now notice that the energy keeps going up, right? So most food chains usually go up only 4 or 5 levels. And notice what's happening to this arrow here. So the amount of energy here is shown in the form of this arrow, which is very broad. So that means that there's a lot of energy. And then by the time the carnivore gets the energy, there's less energy. And by the time the top carnivore gets the energy, there's even less energy. So something is happening to this amount of energy by the time the top carnivore gets it, right? Some of the energy gets lost. And we're going to see in just a moment how much of that energy actually does get lost. So here we see that a secondary consumer can be a carnivore, meaning that it only eats meat, and a tertiary consumer is the top carnivore, right? So what are they all connected to? So notice that all levels here, 4, 3, 2, and 1, they are all connected to the decomposers. So who are the decomposers? Well, the decomposers are those organisms that break down all levels in the food chain. So for example, bacteria and fungi are all examples of decomposers. So everything is connected to the decomposers. All right, so here's another picture of the energy pyramid, and this is going to help you get your definitions for heterotrophs and autotrophs. So like I said before, autotrophs are at the lower end of the energy pyramid. Autotrophs are the producers, for example, plants that are able to make their own food. Now, who are the heterotrophs? The heterotrophs are those consumers, whether it be primary, secondary, tertiary, or quaternary consumers. And that means that they have to ingest the food, right? They cannot make their own food. So these consumers, they have to either eat the producers or they have to eat other consumers. Okay, so we have either primary consumers, these herbivores, secondary consumers, which could be omnivores, meaning that they eat both plants and animals, or they could be carnivores. And then we have tertiary consumers, or quaternary consumers that again could be carnivores or omnivores. So what is happening to the energy as we move up these food pyramids? So these food pyramids are showing that feeding relationship between the levels of organisms. So there is a loss of energy between levels of the food chain. And where is the energy lost? Well, energy has to be expedited in some way, right? That is known as the cost of living. So energy needs to be used for growth. Energy needs to be used for cellular respiration, and most of the energy here is lost in the form of waste or feces. Okay, so that's what it costs to live, right? So there is a loss of energy. So these are energies lost to daily living and growth. Only this energy moves on to the next level in the food chain. So as we see the feeding levels again, how much energy can you get from food? So only the energy that is stored in the organism in that form of growth can be passed on. So then that means that anywhere, and again this is an approximation, anywhere from 80 to 90% of energy is lost from one level to the next. That means that only about 10%, maybe 20% of energy is passed on from one organism to the next as you move up a food chain. So here once again you see the food chain can have only about 4 or 5 levels, right? Because then pretty much you run out of energy. So this is an example of a terrestrial food chain, that's a land food chain, and a marine food chain or an aquatic food chain. Here are other sample food chains, for example, a grassland biome, a pond biome, or an ocean biome. And again, notice how the energy moves from the producer to the consumers, right? So it doesn't matter if I turn the food chains upside down. I always need to make sure that that arrow is pointing from producer to consumer. So the organism that is getting the food is also getting the energy. All right, so in your note taker, we're going to see the food webs on the back of your note taker in just a moment. But before we look at food webs, I want to continue looking at energy flowing through ecosystems. So it's getting very noisy. All right, so here we have energy from the sun, right? The sun hits the producers in the plants, right? Plants are able to grow. And there is some loss of energy, right? That's the cost of living. These plants need to go through cellular processes and energy gets lost. The herbivores, or the primary consumers, eat the plants and get some of the energy. About 10 to 20% of energy gets passed on from one trophic level to the next. But there is loss of energy. And then we have the secondary consumers, carnivores, could be omnivores. They get the energy as well. Okay? But again, loss of energy also into the environment. So in your note taker, you have a food pyramid where you have to fill in the trophic levels. So your food pyramid doesn't look exactly like this one, but it's similar, right? So we have a lot of energy that comes in from the sun, right? So for example, here you have 1 million joules of sunlight. Well, the primary producers are going to get most of that energy. So here at the bottom of this food chain pyramid of energy, you're going to see that the primary producers have about 10,000 joules of energy, right? By the time this primary consumer feeds on the primary producers, is only going to get about 10% of that energy. So this grasshopper here is only going to get about 1,000 joules of energy. By the time that this grasshopper serves as food for this mouse, right? The mouse is only going to gain 10% of that energy. So the mouse is only going to get 100 joules of energy. And by the time this mouse serves as food for this snake is only going to get about 10 joules of energy. Again, only about 10% of energy is passed from one trophic level to the next. Depending on the ecosystem, some ecosystems can be more efficient and they can pass a little bit more energy from one trophic level to the next. But we can say about average 10% of energy is passed from one trophic level to the next. And there it is. It's a beautiful pyramid. Now, if you compare the pyramid of energy, right, which we just looked at right now, with numbers, what do you see here? So if we translate the amount of producers as far as numbers are concerned, right, what do you notice here? Oops, let's do that again. So notice again that there is a greater number of primary producers, right? Here you have about 1 billion primary producers. There's going to be less primary consumers, less secondary consumers, and less tertiary consumers. So there's also a pyramid of numbers, and as you move up the pyramid of numbers, the number gets smaller and smaller. Okay. Does that make sense? Well, yeah, right? Because you need to have a lot of producers, right, with a lot of energy so that they can provide that energy to these consumers. By the time these tertiary consumers get energy, is going to be less energy at the top of this pyramid. So therefore, there are less tertiary consumers. All right, so at the bottom of your note taker, you are to define the different types of pyramids. So there's pyramid of energy, pyramid of biomass, and pyramid of numbers. So a pyramid of biomass, what does it measure? But first let's define biomass. So biomass is mass of living organisms, including plants, animals, and microorganisms. So we see a pyramid of biomass here, and what does it measure? Well, it measures biomass, right? It measures how many living organisms, including plants and animals and microorganisms, are found. So notice that if you look at a pyramid of biomass, there's always going to be more producers than primary consumers, than secondary consumers, than tertiary consumers. So a pyramid of biomass, again, is a pyramid, right? It's very abundant at the bottom and few numbers at the top. What about a pyramid of numbers? Well, we just looked at it a couple slides ago. So again, a pyramid of numbers measures the number of organisms that can be found within a particular trophic level. So here in the producer trophic level, you see a lot of producers, right? You see about 5 million producers. For primary consumers, you see less. For secondary consumers, you see less, only about 5,000. And then for tertiary consumers, you see even less. So again, it is a pyramid because it's very broad at the bottom and very small at the top. All right. So just a thought here. Looking at your pyramids of energy, biomass, and numbers. How many people can Earth support if we are all meat eaters or if we are all vegetarians? So let's look at these two pictures here for a moment. So what do you think? Would we be able to support more people if we were all meat eaters? Or would we be able to support more people on this planet if we were all vegetarians? Well, by looking at these two numbers, right, definitely if we were all vegetarians, we would be able to support more people, right? Because we would then become primary consumers. So since there's an abundant number of primary producers, that would be able to sustain a greater number of human vegetarians. But because humans, a lot of humans eat meat, right? Then we can no longer be primary consumers. We become secondary consumers. And in that case, that means there's less primary consumers. So then there's going to be even less secondary consumers or human meat eaters. So just a thought here, right? If we were all vegetarians, then that means that our planet, with its limited resources, would be able to support most of us. Okay, there it is. All right, so let's go back to the food web because this is one part that we have not looked at. So the food web is on the back of your note taker. So what do food webs show? So food webs are linked food chains. So a food web shows the feeding relationships of many different organisms that are part of a linked food chain. Okay, so notice here that you have many different organisms interconnected. So it shows you who is eating who is eating meat, who are carnivores, who are eating plants, and is showing you all the different connections throughout the ecosystem. So a food web, just like the word web means, right, it's many interconnections. So for example, here you see this plankton, and this plankton in this aquatic food chain is serving as food for many different organisms, right? So squid can feed on it, fish can feed on it, and carnivorous plankton can also feed on it, right? Now, if we look at the producer here in this food chain, who would the producer be? Right? Well, the producer is the phytoplankton. So this is a type of organism that is an autotroph that is able to make its own food. So this phytoplankton is serving as food for the herbivorous plankton and the krill. And then these organisms serve as food for other organisms here. Now, just like food chains, you also have top carnivores or top consumers. So in this particular food web, humans would be the top consumer here. So you see different levels as well. So in the aquatic food web that you have in your note taker, you're supposed to make a list of who you believe the producers are, the primary consumers, and the secondary consumers are. So in your food web, you also have phytoplankton, right? Because you need to have that producer there. So that phytoplankton in your food web is the producer, and then probably some krill or herbivorous plankton are the primary consumers, and then that carnivorous plankton can be a secondary consumer, or a fish can be a secondary consumer, and then probably in your food web, turtles can be tertiary consumers or perhaps secondary consumers. And then a shark or a whale could be a top consumer, whether it's tertiary or quaternary consumers. Okay. All right, so that is it for today. I hope you enjoyed your lesson, and I'll see you next time.